Hello, in this new tutorial of Angular 8 and ASP.NET Core. So today we'll see how to make a web API application for our project as for our project Angular 8. So let's begin by create a new project. We select application web ASP.NET Core and let's call it forms.webapi. And here let's select web API. We can change the .NET Core version. We'll see in this tutorial make 2.2 framework. So let's create the project. And now we'll add a library project which called models. This project will represent the models of our application. Let's add other new project which called enums, which will contain all the enumeration in this web API. So this is best practices is the separation of models enumeration data DTU in a library project in order to reuse it in all other project. So now we create a repository project and manager project for business logic layer. So now let's create a new folder which called BLL business logic layer, and let's drag and drop managers. So the manager concern will contain all the business logic, so we can make query, add some business rules, etc. And let's create a new folder which called DAL data access layer, and other folder which called data layer, model layer, yeah, which called can drag and drop models project and enums project. So here is our model. Let's rename the class and it will be user class. So here we make a base model. It's the parent model for all our models classes. So here let's rename the user class into user model. It's a best practices to name the class with something model in order to make this clear. So here we use the base model like a parent class, and here let's make this base model class public, and let's add by default the ID property. So all the models contain ID property by default. So here in the user model class, let's add first name property, and let's duplicate it, and here we add the last name property. Let's duplicate it, and here we add the email property. So here we'll modelize the user model, which contain the first name, the last name, the email, the password, the mobile number at the moment. Let's make the mobile type of int, So here let's add some commands in order to make the code clear. So the best practices, the commands begin of property begin by gets or sets the property name, gets or sets the last name. So we can install style coop NuGet package in order to make our code um, clear, and in order to respect the best of practices, which naming the property, the classes, the constructor, etc. So here let's add the password and gets or sets password. So that's good. Here we have our user model. So now let's install the data annotation NuGet package. System component model dot annotations and install the last version. So here we have the list of dependency. So now let's go to the base model and let's add the attribute database generated, and here let's add the using, and here database generated option, and it will be identity. So here we'll tell entity framework that the ID is identity, which when we make insert in the database, so the SGBD will increment by one the ID and insert it in the database. So here in the forms repositories project, let's install entity framework package. So here we need to change the source package to all, and here we have entity framework core. We needed to change the version. So here we have 3.0 version of entity framework, and our project is 2.1 version. So let's change and install entity framework. So here we need to add a new library class, which called forms.dal data access, and this project will contain the data context of our database. So here let's install entity framework package also. Yeah. So let's delete this default class and add a new class which called forms context. So let's make this class public, and let's extend the parent class which called db context. Great. So now let's create the constructor. It will be forms context, and it will use the base constructor, and here normally we have to give the connection string name. And we have to set our model. So let's add a new property, dbset user model, and the name, let's add reference of models project, and here the property will be users. So here we have to add, we have to name the properties in the plural in order to say this table will be the list of um, users. So this is a best practice, is to make all the property names represented a table in the database in the plural. So here in the forms data access project, let's install entity framework package. So here I think we need to install the 2.2.6 entity framework core. And we can see, yeah, and here we can see all the package, NuGet package installed. So here we have entity framework 2.2.6. We need to install also SQL server package, Microsoft Entity Framework core.sql. That's great. So no, in the forms context we need to use the base directly. We don't need the connection string name and the base constructor. And here in the on configuring method we need to set the connection string. So it's the normal connection string which we use it in ASP.NET Classic MVC5, for example. You need to copy and paste this connection string and rename the catalog name. So here we need also to install the Microsoft Entity Framework Tools package in order to make operation on update, on create, etc. It should be for Entity Framework command line. So here we have the three package, Entity Framework.NET Core, Entity Framework.SQL Server, and Entity Framework Core.Tools. So now we need to install also the .NET Core design. That's great. So I think that's that's all. So now let's execute some PowerShell script. So here we need to add a migration init database, or initial. We need to make a name in order to make traces in database. So here we don't have entity framework, so we need to select the project by default, and it will be forms dot data access. And now let's execute our command add migration and show, and that's great. We see that this command generate a folder migration which contain all the SQL script. So now we need to execute update database in order to run this script in database, and that's done. Great. Let's connect to the database. So first of all, we need to launch SQL Server, the SGBD server. So here we need to see SQL localDB.exe start. Here we need to start the server. That's great. And now let's connect. Let's create a new connection. So here we need to make the name of server localDB slash mssql localDB. And now let's select our database, which is called forms. Test the connection. That's great. Now we can see our table users. So that's great. Here we have our table with the different columns. So that's all for data access. Now let's move to repositories project, and here we need to install entity framework, entity framework core. Let's choose the version 2.2.6. Yeah, that's okay. So in this project we need to define all the repositories which communicate with the forms data access. So the repository is its responsibility to access databases data um, with the DB context. So let's make a folder which called common, and another folder which called interfaces. So here we define a generic repository is something to define the CRUD operation, the common operation between all the table in the database. So like get, insert, update, delete. So let's make this generic repository public, and now let's create an interface which called iGeneric repository. So normally this generic repository will satisfy all the standard operation CRUD. If we have a specification, we need to extend this generic repository and redefine the method. So here in the generic repository, let's copy this code. You can get it from GitHub repository. So here we have the get method, so which take a filter and order by, and the last parameter is include the properties. So we need this to make our code generic. So here we have all the CRUD operation, or we can say all the common operation between the table. So in this generic repository, we implement this iGeneric repository interface. And here, let's implement all this method. So you can find also this code in the site of Microsoft, ASP.NET. it's the famous code in order to make repository onto work. So it's a very good tutorial. You can see it. So now we need to set entity type. So the entity, here we have a generic repository will use a data model type of entity, and this entity will be a type of base model. Let's recall it to T entity and T entity. That's great. So here, let's make a protected property which called forms context, type of forms context, and which called db60 context. And let's make another protected property which type of dbset, type of tentity. So here is a dynamic code. So the dbset type of tentity will be defined when we use the real repository of user repository. For example, is a declarative approach. So here we need to inject um, forms context, which we can call context, and here let's initialize the db, the protected db context to the context, and the db set it's equal to context dot set t entity. That's great. So let's define some method here. For example, the delete by ID. So here we need to set the entity to delete. It's equal to dbset.find by ID. And here we need to make this dot delete entity to delete. And now let's define the delete by entity. So let's check first of all if the db context dot entry the db context property, yeah, dot entry entity to delete dot state it's equal to entity dot delete. So here dbset dot attach the entity to delete, and that's all. So here we need to set the dbset dot remove entity to delete. So the saved changes is it's not will not make the save here in the repository because it's not um, his job to save the data of to make the transaction. So the repository it's responsible only for making the operation. So the saved changes will become with which called unit fork, and the unit fork and the repository will be used in the business layer logic we can save the data and launch the operation, save the data. So here we'll implement all other methods, get by ID and insert entity. So the get by ID will need to give the ID number, and you return the dataset.find ID. So the insert method will give the entity or the model, and here we'll make dbset.addEntity and we'll return the entity ID. If the entity ID is equal to 0, so the operation we have a problem. If it's greater than 0, so we return the real ID inserted in the database. So the update method, we need to update by entity. We have here two type of update an entity or update a list of entities. So in the same way, here we have dbset.attach entity to update, and the db context entry state, we set the state to the modified state. So in order to update all a list of entities, so here we need to use the update entity method, and for each entity in the list we'll update it. That's all. So great, here we have our generic repository. We need to implement the get method. It's the last one, I think. Yeah. So here we need to set the query. So the get, we can make a where clause, can add also order by. So we need to set the query type of equeryable, type of t entity. We'll set this query to dbset. So is the filter different from null? So let's set the query to query.where the filter. So here for each property and include properties. So here we are in the approach of code first. So in order to to get an item from database and is in relation with other table, we can include this relation between these two tables. So we need to include this property in our query. So here we need to make for each include property in include properties splitted by comma. So here we need to use string option remove empty entries. So here we need to make also query dot included property, and we set it to the query. So finally we need to check if we have an order by. It's different from null. So let's return order by query dot to list. Else the order by is null, so we return the query to list. And this is our get generic method. So now let's add a new class which called unit of work. Make a mistake here. So it's a unit of work. Let's make the class public, and let's add an interface which called, let's rename this, yeah. And now let's add a new interface which called unit of work. So we need to use interfaces in order to make dependency injection after that in the forms.web API project. So let's make this interface public, and this interface will contain only the commit method. Commit. Great. So now let's implement this interface. And here we need to use iDisposable. So after the unit of work finished his work, we have to dispose the resource in order to disposing the memory. So here let's make a private property which called forms context. It's the DB context, and here we need to make a boolean in order to say it's this resource is disposed or not. So by default it's initialized to false. So on the constructor here we have to inject a DB context type of forms context. So let's set the local DB context to this injected context, and in this commit method we need to make db context.save changes method. So that's great. Now we have to define a public and private dispose in order to disposing this resourcing after finishing work. So we need to make a private dispose. It's a method return void and take one parameter is disposed. So here we need to check if is disposed. So if not disposed, the general property disposed is initialized to false. So if not disposed, which means if disposed equal to false, so we need to check also if we need to dispose this resource. So we need to make db context dot dispose. After that we say dispose is equal to true, and in the public void dispose we need to say dispose is equal to true, and we need to call the garbage collector in order to finalize this disposing. That's great. That's all for unit of work. So we finished with repository forms, I think. So before moving to business layer, here we need to make a user repository. So users repository, it's very simple now. We'll implement a user interfaces. So here we make a users interface repository interface, and here let's make it public, and this user interface will use the iGeneric repository type of user model. So here we need to make a declarative repository. All the new repository will be declarative here in order to make dependency injection in the Forms Web API. So here we need to define the iGeneric repository user model, and here we have our user repository. It will use the generic repository class. So the generic repository class, we can make it abstract class. So I prefer to use implemented method directly in the generic repository. So we make ordinary class, parent ordinary class. So here we use also the users repository, And now we need to define the constructor. So we need to generate the constructor, and here we have the context by default generated for me, and that's all. Great, let's delete this unnecessary usings, and now we finish it with the user repository. So let's move to the business layer logic layer. So now we have to create users manager. So in this class we can define also um, all the rules, the business rules. So in our case here, it's very simple. We have to query the database via the repositories. So it will be simple here. So let's create a users manager interface. So this is best practices to make the separation of concern. So here we have the business logic is separated from the repository or the data layer access data access layer. So it's make the task of unit test easily testable. So now we need to use the I user manager. So for example, if we need to make a log service, so we can define a base manager. It will in which we define the default services which used by all the manager. So in order to to do not make repetition of code. So here we need to define the get user by ID. It's a method. We'll get user by its ID and return the user model. So here we are in code first approach. If we are in database approach, we need to define two type of entity, the model entity and the business entity, because we the database first entity framework use another type of properties in order to save the context, etc. It will be the query will degenerate the performance. In which, in this case, we need to make some mapping using framework of mapping, or we can make manual mapping using a business entity and a model entity. So here we need to define um, some method which called get user by ID, and we'll use the injected repository. As simple as that. It's very nice here. So we need to make also get all user, I think. Yeah, get users. This is the interface, so we need to make semicolon. So here we injected the user repository. We make this repository as a private read-only property, and we will use the method existed in this repository. So here we need to get all the user. We don't have to make a filter or order by or include the properties. We don't need it in this case. So let's create a new folder which called common, and now we need to define a base manager. Make it public. this base manager will use a unit of work. Unit of work. So all managers will use the unit of work in order to save the context or to make a transaction. So here we need to make protected unit of work, so it's visible in only in all classes which implements this base manager. So in this user manager we need to use, or we need to inject the unit of work, and in the base constructor we need to pass it directly, and this users manager need to implement the base manager. Yeah, so we need to add insert user, which take user model type. So here we can see he doesn't find the base constructor, so we need to implement the base manager, comma, and control semicolon, and let's see import the common base manager. That's great. So here let's implement insert user, and let's use our user repository.insert. So here we can make some business rules. For example, we can check if the user exists or not. We can check the email exists or not in the database before making the insertion. I don't know, we can make many others business rules. For example, we don't need to have a duplicated name in the database, etc. So here we use the insert, which make the operation of insertion in the context, in the local context, and the unit of work, his job is to commit this data in the database. After that, we need to return the ID, the inserted ID. So if it's 0, so the insertion, we have a problem here, an exception. For example, um, if we have an ID greater than 0, so the operation was executed with success. So in the web API we need to add a new controller which called users controller. That's great. So we need to inject some dependency injection, and it will be the iUser manager. So the controller in the web API will inject or will use directly and only the manager concern, and this is the separation between the concern concept. So we normally, if we do grade our code, we don't need to see in the controller the repository access directly. So we need to pass via the manager. So now let's define the standard operation. Now let's get user by ID. Let's get user, all the list of user, etc. So here we need to define get user by ID, and let's return user model. And the user manager dot get user by ID, and let's pass the ID, and let's make return. That's great. So here we have some problem because we can't install entity framework on the version 2.1. We have a different um, version of .NET Core, so here we need to install the version 2.2 on the web API. So let's download it and yeah, let's close Visual Studio. Let's run. So let's relaunch Visual Studio, and here normally we have the 2.2. That's great. And now we need to install Entity Framework Core. So let's see, user control, control car, control U, and I think that's great. Yeah. And here let's use the right using, compiling the project. Mhm. So we need to upgrade the Razor design to the version 2.2. So let's make it. So that's cool. It's 2.2. Let's go to the package NuGet manager and let's upgrade the Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Razor.Design. So we need to go to the 2x2 2.2 version. Yeah, that's cool. So let's build the project. We can clean before building the project. So we clean all and let's regenerate the project, and normally it will be okay. So that's great. So now let's implement get users method, and it will return enumerable of user model get users, and here we return the user repository dot get users. Cool. So here we need to use the right using, and it will be system.collection.generic. Yeah, and let's delete the system.collections. So here we need to add also the insert method, insert user. And so in this action, will this action take like parameter user model, and we use the user manager dot insert user. So here our manager will run the repository insertion operation, and after that we'll use the unit of work save changes. So here that's okay. I think we need to make some dependency injection in the configuration service. So here let's add services dot and here the user manager class. So let's import the right using. That's great, and I think it's not it's not a parameter. Let's use it like type of data, and here's the same thing. We'll take this user manager and we'll use it like a type of data. So here we have the first services, um, the interface. It will be the type of injection, dependency injection. It will be the interface, and the real instantiation of instance of this object will use the right class, which the user's manager. So in the same way, we'll make the others um, dependency. So we need to add the unit of work, the DB context, and the user repository, certainly, and the user manager. So let's add the forms context. That's cool. And so here, if we don't declare correctly the dependency injection or the service, all the necessary service, so we will have a nice exception when um, when launching the application. So here we can see that's it. So here we can't instantiate the type unit of work, and the class is unit of work also. So here we need to define the right class, and we need to define the right user repository class. So let's see again. Let's launch the application, and here we have the default API values. So let's make, so here we see that we don't define the verbs of HTTP GET and HTTP POST. So let's do it the GET user by ID, and let's define the root. It will be the ID, and here we get all the user. We don't need nothing, so it will be HTTP GET only, and here we have the HTTP post, and the root will be user module. So we need to declare this like from body. Let's go to the package manager, NuGet package manager, and now we need to install something which called a Swagger. So Swagger is a nice package. It will be used in web API project in order to facilitate, or in order to make clear, um, easy to test and to use this web API normally for the business analyst. So after installing the package, we need to make some configuration. Here we need to add Swagger, the title and the version, and declare it like a services. So in the startup CS, let's go to configure service method, and let's add this service Swagger. So we need to use OpenAPI info. So it's not the correct one. I think we need to use info. Yeah, we need to make new info using ASP.NET Core.Swagger, and here let's define the title and the version. So So we can define the title, which will be, for example, forms. Web API, and the version it will be 1.0, for example. So you can see here the version. So what else? And now in the configure method, insert middleware to export the generated Swagger as a JSON endpoint. So here we need to add the JSON endpoint. So we need to add in the configure method app uses Swagger, and here app.swagger use Swagger, yeah. So we need to define the endpoint, and it will be the S, and we need to make semicolon here and another parenthesis. Yeah, that's great. So let's rename it to Forms API version 1. Cool. So let's run it. And the URL swagger slash index.html, and here we see all the exposed web API with its documentation. If we add the commands and the code, we will see this documentation directly in this interfaces. It's very nice in order to use or to test some operations, and we can see the exposed model also. So here, for example, we'll test the post um, users. For example, here we'll set the first name and the last name, adding an email. I don't know. Yeah, make div. Yeah, let's make forms.com, and the password we make something 12345 for the moment, and after that we'll need to encrypt this data in the database and the transfer between the web API and the Angular project. So let's add a mobile number, and finally an ID. It will be 0. Let's execute, and here we can see the response. It's 200, which means the success of operation. And let's see in the table the user tables, users table. So let's show the data, and here, yeah, that's nice. Here we see that we have our line is inserted, and here we can make the get operation. So let's execute it, and let's say 1 tag execute, and here we have our data model with the data. So that's nice. So it will be, that's all for today. We see how preparing web API